So, starting at the beginning of chapter 11, it says, "Then it came about," and this is obviously after the defeat of the southern kings of Canaan with Joshua and his army. So now, in chapter 11, we're fighting with a new group of people. And it says, "Then it came about when Jabin, the king of Hatzor, heard about what had happened down south, that he sent to Yovav, the king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Aksaph, and to the kings who were of the north in the hill country, and in the Arabah, south of the Kinnerot, and in the lowland, and on the heights of Dor, on the west, to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and the Amorite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Jebusite in the hill country, and the Hiphite at the foot of Hermon in the land of Mizpeh. They came out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. So all of these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'Do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver of all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire.' So Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom and attacked them. And the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as Great Sidon and Misrepot Maim and the valley of Mizpeh to the east, and they struck them until no survivor was left to them. And Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. Then Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hatzor and struck its king with the sword. For Hatzor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms. They struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed. And he burned Hatzor with fire. Joshua captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed them, just as Moses, the servant of Yahweh, had commanded. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds, except Hatzor alone, which Joshua burned. All the spoil of these cities and the cattle the sons of Israel took as their plunder, but they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. They left no one who breathed. Just as Yahweh had commanded Moshe his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that Yahweh had commanded Moses. Thus Joshua took all the land, the hill country and all the Negev, all the land of Goshen, the lowland, the Arabah, the hill country of Israel and its lowland, from Mount Halak that rises towards Seir, even as far as Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon at the foot of Mount Hermon. And he captured all their kings and struck them down and put them to death. Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except the Hivites living in Gibeon. They took them all in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, to meet Israel in battle, in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them, just as Yahweh had commanded Moshe. Then Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anav, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. There were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod some remained. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that Yahweh had spoken to Moshe, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to the children of Israel by their divisions and by their tribes. Thus the land had rest from war. All right. So I am stopping that. So that was I was going to say, when we studied I guess it's about a month now that we studied when Joshua defeated the southern. Well, remember that they crossed the Jordan River and defeated Jericho and Ai, and they went up onto the plateau and kind of took over some of that central area, and then they went south and kind of defeated everybody down south. And now, because of what happened down there, the word is spreading, and the people up north decide to band together to fight against Joshua and the sons of Israel. And we talked before about some of these people and these place names down south. And this one is certainly no different. We've got some very interesting things to observe here. And I want to start by taking a look, and I have mentioned to you guys before that it's always beneficial to take a look at these place names, because it really can be very instructive for you. Number one, of course, we're looking at this historically. We know that this is a historical event, that Joshua was invading the land of Canaan and defeated all the enemies of Israel, and the children of Israel began to possess this land. But one thing that I'll continuously remind you is that I am firmly convinced that this is what Hollissa Alewine would call a proto-prophecy. That these are the nuggets of prophecy which is revealing things to be happening in the end of days. I totally believe that to be true, and I think that once I show you a couple of things that you can see in this chapter, that it certainly starts to look that way. The first thing I want to point out to you is from chapter 11, verses 1 through 4, is some of these place names and some of the people names. You've got Yavin, Jabin. His name means whom God observes. Okay, and he is the king of Chatzor, which means castle. He's the king of the castle. You've got Yovav or Jobab, which means a desert. He's the king of Madon. Madon means strife, like strife and contention. You've got the king of Shimron, the king of Aksaph, and the other kings of the north are not identified by name. It just tells you that there are other kings from these place names. Shimron is a watch height, like a city on a hill, I guess you could put it that way. Now this one's weird. Aksaph, I shall be bewitched, from the word chasaph, which means to practice sorcery. Okay, you've got the other kings of the north. Interestingly enough, when you look up that Hebrew word north, it's quite fascinating, and you can see some very interesting things when you do research on just the word north in the Hebrew Bible. That word for north is saphon, which means hidden, dark, gloomy, unknown. So that's very strange in and of itself. And they are also, the enemies are also among the plains of the Kinnerot, that is the harp, that's what they call the Sea of Galilee, and the borders of Dor, which means generation. So interesting to look at some of these people and these place names and say that we've got a leader named Yavin, whom God observes, who is the king of the castle, together with the guy called the desert, and who is the leader of this place called strife and contention, from a watch height, and another king who was practicing sorcery from a dark, hidden, gloomy, unknown place. Now, remember also that the north is often referenced in prophetic warnings. And I'll bring your attention to a couple of passages that kind of highlight this. One of them is Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. And I happen to have those here. I'll just read that little section to you. Jeremiah 1, 14 through 15 says, "And Yehovah said to me, out of the north shall evil break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land. For behold, I am calling all the families of the kingdoms of the north, saith Yehovah, and they shall come, and they shall set every one his throne at the entering of the gates of Jerusalem, and against all the walls thereof round about, and against all the cities of Judah." So there's number one. You can also take a look at Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 6. It says there in Jeremiah 4:6, "Set up a banner towards Zion. Take to flight. Do not stay there. For I am bringing evil from the north and a great destruction." So there's number two. Jeremiah 6:1 is a third one. And listen to this. This same theme keeps ringing in the ear. "Flee for safety, you children of Benjamin, out of the midst of Jerusalem, and blow the trumpet in Tekoa, and set up a signal in Beth Hacharim, for evil appears out of the north, and a great destruction." And then one more, Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 4 and 5, and it says here, "And I looked, and behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire unfolding itself. And a brightness was about it, and out of the midst thereof, as the look of glowing brass out of the midst of the fire. Also out of the midst thereof, the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man." And you can continue to read further down, and that gets more and more interesting for sure. But these kings that are confederated against Joshua and his people are coming from the north. The north is very mysterious, dark and gloomy. Yehovah in his readings from the Torah and the prophets often talks about evil, destruction, bad things coming out of the north. And so these people are representative of something, I believe, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Also, I think I want to bring your attention to the idea, from what I have described to you so far, does this remind you of anything that you have heard about from the end times, maybe some end time prophecies? I mean, some of those are certainly ones that I just read just now, but anything from any other books or prophetic utterances about end times, does this remind you of anything?
Like the one that's going to come from the north to attack Israel. Armies out of the north. It talks about that in Revelation.
Yes, that's kind of what it reminded me of as well. I think I made a note to myself here. If you look at, the Northern Confederation, very numerous and largely descending from the north, although there are elements from the east as well. And this does remind me of passages from both Revelation 9:16 and 16:12, which is perhaps describing the same thing, but in both spiritual and temporal terms. This passage here, let's say Revelation 9:16, talks about these 4 angels were loosed in backing up just a little bit to verse 15, these 4 angels were loosed who were prepared for the hour and the day and the month and the year, that they might slay the 3rd part of men, and the number of the hosts of horses was twice 10,000 times 10,000. I heard their horses. That is talking about a very great army. And the second passage from Revelation 16:12 kind of makes me think of the same thing because, well, let me just point this out first. It says, and the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way of the kings of from the rising of the sun might be prepared. Now, this is talking about that great army that is coming from the north and the east. And I note that in this passage that we were just talking about, that it spoke about these enemies of Israel and Joshua at this time were like the sand upon the seashore, which is an interesting phrase. And you've heard the children of Israel described as both the stars in the heavens and the sand of the seashore. And I think there has been a case made from some scholars that those might be two separate groups of people, like spiritual Israel and physical Israel. As you can probably imagine which is which. It's an interesting idea, and I can't speak definitively about it, but it's certainly an interesting idea. Angela, do you have anything you'd like to say? Or anything? Okay, just checking with her. She's over there being quiet. I figured I'd ask her what's going on.
I'm just looking at a different north.
Okay. So between chapters 10 and 11, a progression of battles against the spiritual darkness of the south and the physical darkness of the north seems to be in mind here. I will explain to you, for example, that if you are God sitting on his throne, which is the Ark of the Covenant, you're facing east, right, inside the temple. And you, just outside the curtain on your right-hand side is what? That is the menorah. The menorah is going to be on your right-hand side toward the south.
And the Hebrew word for south is the same as the Hebrew word for right.
Yeah, so Angela reminded me that the Hebrew word for south is the same as the Hebrew word for right, the right hand, for example. And then if you are Yehovah sitting on your throne, to the left in the foyer of the tabernacle, for example, is the faces of the showbread, which is a physical thing. We got light on the right and bread on the left. And I think that those battles that took place down south seemed to be, do you remember that we noted last time that the kings from the south had names that sounded like righteous men's names. Adonai-Zedek and other names like that, the Lord of righteousness, but they were not righteous. Here we have guys who are pretty straight up evil. They're not pretending to be good, for example, but they're like the sand of the sea. There's a great multitude of them. Carla?
I was just going to answer if you asked a question.
Oh, okay. Okay. Excellent. So this is interesting. Also want to point out a couple of other details to you. Number one, they are gathered at the waters of Merom. Note that these northern kings are gathered together against Joshua at the waters of Merom. Now, waters, if you hear, sometimes there's a prophetic picture in your mind, a metaphor, a symbol, for example, of what waters represent. Do you know what that is? What does waters often represent in the Bible? People, yes. So, and remember, I don't know if I pointed this out, but if you look up Merom in the Hebrew, that is a high place. A high place. Now we know what happens in the high places, right? This is where the pagans worship their false gods. So they're gathered at the waters of the high place. If waters represent people and high place are false worship, we might have a huge flock of people who are worshipers of false gods. Perhaps. Just a suggestion. Note also that Mount Moriah, where the temple of Yehovah is not technically a high place. I don't know if you were aware of this. I've never been to Israel myself, but many of you probably have. You'll probably have made note that Mount Moriah, where the temple is not the highest mountain. The other mountains surrounding the city of Jerusalem are actually higher than where Jerusalem is. What does that suggest to you? If all these other false gods and their false worshipers like to place their worship spots on the highest mountain they can find, what does it suggest to you that Yehovah's temple was built on a mountain that is surrounded by higher mountains?
I will set my throne above.
Excuse me?
I think the others want to be higher because of that spirit that says, I will set my throne above yours.
Yeah, they want to be higher than Yehovah because Angela says, like that passage from Isaiah, where I will set my throne above yours, talking about the adversary. I think that the fact that God does not place his temple on the highest mountain in the area suggests that he is humble. That's just what it's suggested. It's always suggested to me, is that he's not interested in trying to prove that he's awesome. He just is awesome. He doesn't need to associate himself with the highest mountain around. But the adversary does. And so these people are gathered at the waters of Merom. The many peoples of the high place is the way I have looked at that. Go ahead, someone? Anyone going to say something? No? Okay, I thought I heard something. Note also that it says that Yehovah, when he was speaking to them when he was speaking to Joshua in verse 6, that he says, Yehovah said to Joshua, "Be not afraid because of them, for tomorrow about this time I will give them all up slain before Israel." In a later passage in one of the ending portions of this chapter, it says that Israel fought for a long time. But note here that it says, by this time tomorrow, they'll all be dead. That suggests to me that we're talking about two different things here. We're talking about the fact that, yes, Joshua and the children of Israel in this historical passage will be fighting for a long time with all of these people in the land. Is it possible that this little conglomeration of kings that we're talking about from verses 1 through 4 were defeated in one day and many others were not, and they had to fight for a long time after that? Certainly it is historically possible that that's the case. But I would suggest to you that perhaps there is a little bit of a deeper meaning, because this reminds me about the day of Yehovah, that these people would be destroyed in a single day, that when the wrath of God comes upon the world, this is not a prolonged battle, that it seems to me like the battle of Armageddon or whatever, where God's wrath comes down and destroys all of his gathered enemies, like you're looking at in Revelation 16, it happens fairly quickly. Now, I think that's perhaps why it says, for tomorrow about this time I will give them all up slain before Israel. I think that's just one of those little elements that leads me to believe, yeah, this is talking about something much later, as well as historical fact about what happened with Joshua. Another really, really interesting thing is that notice in verse 8 that it says that they began to defeat them and chased them, and notice where they chased them to. I want to point out to you that they chased them to Zidon, Great Zidon, Sidon, in what is that country? Is it Lebanon? Yeah, I think that's Lebanon. Tyre and Sidon are on the coast, the northern coast there. But look at this word, Misrepot Maim. You have any idea what Misrepot Maim is? I mean, you've heard the word ma'im. Yeah, water is ma'im. Misripot is the curious one. That means burning. The interesting expression, the burning of the waters. What does that remind you of? Burning waters.
It reminds me of Elijah.
Lake of fire.
The lake of fire, doesn't it remind you of the lake of fire? Curious thing. Remember that when we talked about, when we were studying in the Torah regarding the Exodus, you saw wherever you see fire and water or fire and ice, these two elements in nature that are combined in a passage of the Bible, they seem to coexist together. You've got a sea of fire or a lake of fire. Those two elements don't exist together. It just suggests to me the power of God, that God's presence is there. Something powerful is happening. Notice that Joshua delivered them into that Yehovah delivered all of these people into the hand of Israel, and they chased them to the lake of fire. That's just a curious thing to me. You see that I'm picking up on certain elements here. Sand of the seashore, the waters of the high place, the one who God observes. And note also that this king of Hatzor, when you look at verses 10 through 13, that it basically says that Joshua took special care to destroy this guy Yavin, the one whom God keeps his eye on. From Hatzor, that this whole place, and it says here that he destroyed that place, that this guy, in verse 10 says, "He smote the king of Hatzor with the sword, for Hatzor was in times past the head of all those kingdoms." And that they smote all the souls that were inside with the edge of the sword, destroying them utterly. Now, that you might not recognize that phrase, destroying them utterly, but that is that same Hebrew word that we looked at in Joshua chapter 6, which was cherem, completely devoted to destruction, where that guy, Achan, took some of the spoil that was dedicated to destruction, and he himself brought a curse of destruction upon himself and was burned with fire. So this guy, Jabin from Hatzor, is certainly reminiscent of something. He is the leader of this confederation. His people, his city, and himself are chased to the lake of fire and destroyed utterly. Now, curiously enough, it shows that some of these other places, it's unclear to me, because of verse 12, Joshua took all the kings and the cities of that area, but it says in verse 13, only all the cities that stood upon their hills Joshua did not burn, only Hatzor alone. So that this king's whole city is destroyed, and everyone in it and himself. But it seems like, I'm not certain exactly among all these other peoples who was put to the sword and who was killed. Certainly their kings appear to have been killed, and perhaps their warriors, but it doesn't seem like he burned all those other cities and all of those people. It was just Hatzor. So it suggests to me that we're talking about he is the adversary. And the city, his city, Hatzor, is the city of that anti-Messiah, that the devil, however you want to phrase that, and his people. They are destroyed utterly, chased to the lake of fire and destroyed utterly. That's something about the north, dark, gloomy, mysterious, coming out of the north, fighting against the people of God. God shows up and destroys them completely, somewhere near a burning lake of fire. There's some burning waters. It's very curious to me. Very curious to me. Daniel 11, Angela says the same thing. So just take a note to yourself about some of these passages and kind of dig around a little bit, and I think you'll see some very interesting things. Also note that Joshua is instructed to kill or lame their horses. That is, it says hoe their horses in some of the translations. This is from verse 9. Hoe literally means to hamstring a horse. Or it could mean to destroy. So he is instructed to kill or lame their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So I think you have to remember that chariots and horses in these days that we're reading about are the most powerful implements of war. Battle horses and chariots are the most powerful implements of war that they have in those days, and Joshua is instructed to destroy them completely. I don't know if that is because whether this would eliminate the enemy's ability to make war, or at least to just diminish it. I'm not certain. Certainly a lot of these people are left alive. But one of the things that this reminds me of, and I don't know why it reminds me of, there's nothing explicitly in the text that is, really connected there. But it just reminded me of these two passages. One of them is in Joel chapter 3, verses 9 through 11, where when Yahweh is drawing these people out to battle. And notice also that this is the same thing that we see here in verse 20, where it says, it was the heart of Yahweh, it was for Yahweh, it was because of Yahweh that their heart was hardened, and he drew them out. We've talked about that before too, that we see this pattern repeated over and over, that maybe they didn't, it was in their heart to hate God's people and to fight against God, but they were probably afraid and didn't want to do so, and he hardens their heart. He gives them strength and courage. Come on out. It's going to be okay. Come on out. Let's fight. Yeah, he sticks his hook in the jaw and says, it's okay. Come on out. Let's fight. I know you want to. Don't be afraid. I'll give you courage to fight. It doesn't turn out so well for them, but he's drawing them out to battle. And in Joel chapter 3, verses 9 through 11, it talks about, hey, turn your pruning hooks into spears and turn your plows into swords and come, get ready for battle. I'm drawing you out. That's in Joel chapter 3, verses 9 through 11. But then also the inverse of that, in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, is where you have the inverse, where it says, turn your spears into pruning hooks and your swords into plowshares, because now the war is over and it's time to be fruitful and multiply and grow crops and get back to living. That's just what it reminded me of. Like I said, there's nothing that I'm aware of in the text that suggests that directly. It just made me think of it. Anybody, any comments, questions, concerns about this?
Just a comment about like the horses and the chariots. If they're in the natural, most people would probably say, why would you kill the horses or maim them when you could use them yourself? Just take them and let's ride these horses and be as strong as some of these other countries or kingdoms. But I think it's really because as an implement of war, man was not supposed to know war, that God wouldn't let them use them, and he doesn't want war, so he would make them get rid of those implements of war, which we're never supposed to know about.
Right.
So I just thought that made sense.
That's a good observation, and I recall that in the Torah, when it's talking about the Torah of the king, that the king is not to accrue for himself many horses. And they're not supposed to get chariots, and stuff like that. And I think that's because these are powerful implements of war, and they will deliberately put their faith in these implements of war instead of putting it in God. And I think, unfortunately today you can see, some believers who talk about, the end times and, we need to have weapons. I can't find any ammo, they sold all the ammo and we can't get any ammo for our guns. It's like, I'd like to have some ammo too, just because I like to go shooting and I don't want to use up all my ammo if I'm not going to be able to replace it. However, God is going to, if He decides that I am worthy of living, it's not going to be because of my gun. And I can't eat, army rations from the 80s for 3.5 years, or God forbid, 7 years. I couldn't afford to buy enough rations to last that long. Did God say, not by my spirit, but by army rations I will preserve thee? No, I don't think so. He's going to, is it nice to have a gun to defend yourself and to sport shoot and stuff? Absolutely. But I'm not looking to that, and I don't think anyone else should either, to hoard this or that. I mean, I was just reading in 2 Kings chapter 4 where there's this long passage about Elijah, is a lower guy, Elisha, feeding a widow who had nothing left. She was poor and her sons were going to be sold into servitude, indentured servitude to pay her debts. And, she was taken care of because she had one jar of oil, and that, a miracle happened. And then, of course, with Elijah, talking to that widow who said, I got a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil, and we're going to cook ourselves a last meal, and then we're going to die. I think that is what God does continuously. You think about Yeshua and the fish, multiplying a couple of fish and a couple of loaves of bread. That's the way He takes care of His people. You see the same thing in 2 Kings chapter 4, which I was just talking about. Right at the end of that chapter, they had a little bit of food and like 100, the whole prophets' there was like 100 prophets and their families, and He was like, we don't have enough to feed all these people. He's like, come, bring them on in. It was just like the feeding of the 5,000, Elisha did that in that chapter. So I think that's just an amazing promise, and that in this case here, He's saying, you don't need chariots. If you had them, you would just begin to trust in them. And if you have horses, you would just begin to trust in them. I personally, as far as I know that many American ranchers and stuff use horses. But most of the livestock and ranching that happens in the Middle East does not rely on horses at all. I mean, donkeys can carry things, can carry people. Young children guard, the sheep and herd them around. Oxen pull the plow. So there's not a whole lot of use for horses, especially in biblical times. Horses were, in those days, pretty much specifically for fast travel, getting messages around, or fighting battles. So they're not. God doesn't want them trusting in horses or chariots, so He says destroy them completely. Anyway, that's an interesting passage that, to me, really, otherwise I would have just read it to you and said, there it is, guys. Joshua defeats some dudes, and there's not a whole lot interesting to talk about here, and let's move on to the next chapter. I could go into some of the history and who these people are and what archaeologists have found and such, but I don't think that's spiritually instructive. It's very fascinating, and as a guy who's a historian, I like that very much, but I want to have a little bit, hopefully, give you better information than just a history lesson. So I hope that was instructive. I don't have a whole lot more to say about it, but I would say, dig a little deeper beneath these what these words mean, and kind of think about where have you heard this before, and you see some amazing things. And I think this is definitely a passage that is eerily reminiscent of the last days, and these kings of the north maybe conglomerated with these kings of the east, crossing the Euphrates, being like the sand of the sea, and coming against Israel and seeking to destroy her completely. And God shows up and says, I don't think so. This is a prophetic shadow picture of that. I really do. We've seen so many repeated prophetic shadow pictures in the life of Joshua crossing the Jordan and taking the people into the promised land. It's been really, really fascinating to me. So that's all I have for you tonight.